I was halfway to the restaurant when my phone buzzed. It was a message from my daughter. "Dad, please don't talk about your army service tonight. Or your army friends. It makes them uncomfortable." I read it twice, just to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding. But no, there it was. A single sentence that felt like someone had just taken a blade to my gut and twisted. She didn't say, "Let's avoid heavy topics." She didn't say, "Maybe don't get into politics." No, she told me not to talk about my life. The years I spent bleeding, sweating, freezing in deserts and jungles. The brothers I buried. The nightmares I still fight through some nights. Apparently, all of that was uncomfortable. I sat there in my truck for a good 30 seconds, staring at the message. At first, there was this hollow, sinking feeling, like I'd just been told I wasn't welcome in my own family's story. And then, behind that hollow pit, something else started burning. Anger. If you're new here, by the way, I tell true stories. The kind that start with someone stepping on the wrong nerve and end with them realizing they picked the wrong damn person to mess with. If that sounds like your kind of ride, stick around. You're not going to want to miss where this one goes. I took a slow breath, put my phone back in my pocket, and pulled into the parking lot. The place was one of those upscale steakhouses with valets and crystal glasses, the kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices because if you have to ask, you shouldn't be there. I could already see them through the big front window, my daughter, her fiancé, and his parents, all dressed like they just stepped out of a country club ad. The second I walked in, I could feel the shift. My daughter smiled, but it was tight, nervous. Her fiancé gave me a polite nod. His parents? They looked me up and down like they were scanning a thrift store donation bin. We sat down, and it was obvious they planned to lead the conversation. They talked about their latest golf trip, their new vacation home in Florida, the right kind of people they meet at their charity galas. Every now and then, one of them would glance at me, as if waiting to see if I'd slip up and mention, the thing I wasn't supposed to mention. So I kept quiet. I smiled. I laughed when it was socially required. But I noticed every little thing. How the mother wrinkled her nose when I ordered a beer instead of wine. How the father almost smirked when the server misheard my order and I didn't correct him right away. How my daughter kept avoiding my eyes, like she was embarrassed for me just existing. At one point, the father decided to get funny. He chuckled and said, "I guess some people just choose careers that don't translate well into polite conversation." He didn't look directly at me when he said it, but he didn't have to. The table knew exactly who he meant. My daughter didn't say a word. I kept my face calm, but inside, something was snapping. Not in a loud, explosive way. No, this was quieter, sharper. The kind of snap where you know you're not just going to walk away angry. You're going to remember. You're going to plan. The rest of the dinner was a blur. I didn't say much. Didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. But by the time I walked out of that restaurant, I had already made myself a promise. They were going to regret making me feel small. They were going to learn, the hard way, that I don't stay quiet forever. I've eaten in war zones where the food was cold, the flies were relentless, and the air smelled like diesel and gunpowder. But I'd take that over this dinner any day. At least in a war zone, you know where you stand. Here, I was sitting at a polished mahogany table, surrounded by fine china and silverware, and still felt like an unwanted intruder. The father, Richard, had taken control of the conversation like he owned the air in the room. He didn't ask about me. Not once. He talked about his company, his golf handicap, and how he was thinking of running for the HOA presidency because someone needs to raise the standards around here. The mother, Susan, didn't even pretend to hide her judgment. Every time I spoke, her eyes flicked to my watch, my shirt, my hands, like she was cataloging every flaw. It wasn't even subtle. My daughter? She kept her head down, fiddling with her napkin like she wished she could disappear. Every time I thought about bringing her into the conversation, she'd give me this tiny shake of the head, like a silent don't. The first real slap in the face came about halfway through the meal. Richard had just finished telling a story about some kid who painted his fence wrong, and then he looked right at me and said, I've always felt that some people never really adapt to civilian life. They just plateau. He didn't say soldiers. He didn't have to. I knew exactly where that bullet was aimed. I smiled, nodded, and took a sip of my beer. My hand didn't shake. I didn't give him the satisfaction. Then Susan chimed in. "Oh, I'm sure you've traveled a lot though, right? In the military? Must be nice to see the world without actually paying for it. She laughed, like it was a cute joke. That was when I realized this wasn't ignorance. This was intentional. They were probing, testing how far they could push without me breaking. Fine. Let them push. The food was exquisite, but I barely tasted it. I was too focused on every glance, every smirk, every backhanded compliment they threw my way. They talked about old friends from the club, how real connections come from networking, not shared trauma, and how it's important to surround yourself with people who elevate your status. The words shared trauma hit harder than they probably intended. They had no idea what that really meant. They'd never had to carry a brother's body out of a firefight. They'd never had to write a letter to a widow explaining why her husband wasn't coming home. But to them, it was just an abstract, almost amusing concept. By the time dessert was served, I'd stopped responding entirely. I just sat there, smiling politely, letting them think they'd put me in my place. What they didn't know was that I'd already started building the framework of something much bigger than a dinner table comeback. As we stood to leave, Richard gave me a handshake that was all bone and no warmth. Susan gave me a perfumed air kiss that didn't even come within a foot of my cheek. My daughter avoided my eyes entirely. I walked out into the night air, the cool breeze hitting my face, and that's when it solidified in my mind. I wasn't just going to get even. I was going to make them wish they'd treated me with basic respect. And the best part? They wouldn't even see it coming. That night, I didn't sleep. Not a wink. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee that went cold before I even touched it. The house was quiet, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old wall clock. But inside my head, it was loud. Every line they'd thrown at me replayed in my mind, over and over. Never really adapt to civilian life. Must be nice to see the world without paying for it. Surround yourself with people who elevate your status. Status. That's all those people cared about. Titles, possessions, appearances. They didn't respect what they couldn't brag about at their cocktail parties. I pulled an old wooden box out from under the cabinet. It had been years since I opened it. Inside were photos, patches, a few medals, and some letters from friends I served with. Some of those friends are still around. Some, well, they'll never read anything again. One photo stopped me cold. It was from my first deployment. Me and two guys standing in the dust, grinning like idiots despite the heat and the gear. On my left was James "Mac" McAllister, the man who'd later lose his right leg when our convoy got hit. On my right was David Carter, now a city councilman, sharp as a tack, and one of the loudest advocates for veteran rights in the state. I traced their faces with my thumb. These men weren't just army buddies. They were brothers. They'd bled with me, starved with me, saved my life more than once. If someone couldn't respect them, then I knew exactly the kind of person I was dealing with. And that's when the idea started to take shape. Not just a petty payback. No, this was going to be something they couldn't ignore. Something that would make them look in the mirror and see exactly how small they really were. I picked up my phone. It was late, but I knew Mac and Carter wouldn't mind. First, I called Mac. He answered on the second ring. "What's up, brother?" he said, voice warm despite the hour. I told him about the dinner. I didn't hold back, every smug glance, every comment. He went quiet for a moment, then said, "Tell me where to be, and I'll bring my best suit." Then I called Carter. He laughed when I told him. Not a happy laugh, the kind of laugh that means you've just confirmed what you already suspected about certain people. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" he asked. I told him I was, and that I'd need his help to make it bigger. Much bigger. By the time I hung up, I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the same way. This wasn't rage. This was precision. I was going to show my daughter's future in-laws exactly what status meant when it wasn't built on money or privilege. I was going to walk into their world, and I wasn't going alone. They thought they'd silenced me. They had no idea I'd just found my voice. I woke up the next morning with a clear head. This wasn't going to be some impulsive outburst. That would be too easy for them to dismiss. I wanted something precise, calculated, something they'd remember every time they tried to look down on someone again. The key was going to be timing. The wedding was a few months away, but the rehearsal dinner was coming up in just a couple of weeks. That would be my stage. The audience, my daughter, her fiancé, their friends, and of course, Richard and Susan. Perfect. I started with Mac and Carter. We met up at a small diner, the kind where the waitress knows your order before you sit down. Mac rolled in on his carbon fiber prosthetic, wearing jeans and a hoodie, looking like he could still run a mile faster than most 20-year-olds. Carter came straight from a city meeting, sharp suit, briefcase in hand, looking every bit the power player he'd become. I laid it out for them over coffee. This isn't about shouting or fighting, I said. It's about showing them who we are, without a single apology. Mac grinned. You want subtle with teeth. Exactly, I said. Carter leaned forward. I can make calls. Get local press to cover something, say, an announcement. We tie it into the dinner, make it public. They can't ignore it. And just like that, the bones of the plan were in place. Step 1. We'd all attend the rehearsal dinner, dressed to the nines. Mac with his service medals on his jacket. Carter with his councilman pin. Me in my best suit, with one small addition, a lapel pin of my unit. Subtle, but sharp-eyed people would notice. Step 2. Carter would coordinate with a couple of journalists from the local paper and a veterans network. They'd happen to drop by toward the end of the dinner to cover a community announcement. Step 3. The announcement itself. I'd stand, raise a glass, and reveal that in honor of Mac and Carter and the countless others who served, we were launching a veteran support center. Carter had already scouted a location near their country club. It was perfect, close enough that they'd drive past it every week, a permanent reminder of the people they'd dismissed. Mac's smile widened. So, we're hitting them with class, not fists. Exactly, I said again. We're going to be so damn respectful that it'll sting worse than any insult. We spent another hour refining the details. What to wear, how to time the arrival, who to talk to first, even where we'd stand for the announcement so that every camera got the right shot. By the time we left the diner, the plan was airtight. There'd be no yelling, no scenes, just the kind of quiet, crushing blow that leaves the other person lying awake at night, wondering how they managed to get it so wrong. As I got into my truck, I could already see it. Richard's forced smile, Susan's frozen expression, my daughter realizing, maybe for the first time, exactly who her father is. This wasn't just going to be revenge. It was going to be a lesson. A few days after our diner meeting, I got the call from my daughter. Her voice was lighter than it had been at the dinner, like nothing awkward had ever happened. Hey, Dad, she said. We're having the rehearsal dinner in 2 weeks. I'd love for you to come. I could hear the faint sound of chatter in the background, probably her future in-laws. I pictured her sitting in some perfectly decorated living room, phone cradled between her shoulder and ear, trying to keep the conversation casual. I'll be there, I said. Then I added, just as casually, mind if I bring a couple of friends? There was the tiniest pause. Not long enough to be obvious, but I caught it. Sure. Who? She asked. Just some old buddies you haven't met yet, I said. Good guys. You'll like them. She hesitated again. All right. Yeah, that's fine. I thanked her, told her I'd see her soon, and hung up. That was it. The hook was set. From there, the preparations kicked into high gear. Mac took his jacket to be tailored so the line of his medals would be perfect. Carter pulled a few strings with the local press. Nothing too big, just a couple of trusted reporters who knew how to be in the right place at the right time. I even booked a quick haircut and a suit fitting. I wasn't going in there looking like I'd just rolled out of a truck stop. This was going to be a surgical strike, and appearances were part of the ammunition. The trick, I knew, was not to tip my hand. If my daughter or her in-laws suspected anything, they might try to change the venue, control the guest list, or somehow shut it down. So, I stayed off the radar. No big social media posts, no hints to mutual acquaintances. Just quiet, steady preparation. Meanwhile, Mac and Carter were doing their own recon. Mac found out exactly where the dinner would be held, a high-end Italian place with a private room in the back. Carter discovered that the restaurant's owner was a former Marine, which made me smile. That could work in our favor. One evening, Carter called me. It's all lined up, he said. Press will be there. Owner's on board. He's reserving a little extra space in case the announcement draws more people than expected. Perfect. With every detail falling into place, I started to imagine the moment itself. Richard and Susan, all puffed up in their designer clothes, expecting another polite evening where they could steer the conversation and keep me in the corner. My daughter, thinking I'd keep my head down again. But this time, I wouldn't be silent. This time, I'd be the one steering. I went to bed that night with a smile. The dinner wasn't just going to be a social event anymore. It was going to be the opening shot of something much bigger. The night of the rehearsal dinner, I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was eager, but because I wanted to watch the room before the real show began. The restaurant's private room was already buzzing. Warm lighting, polished wood tables, expensive wine glasses catching the glow. Richard stood near the bar, shaking hands like he was running for office. Susan was in a glittering dress, working the crowd, every smile just a little too wide. My daughter saw me first. She looked relieved, maybe because I'd arrived alone. She started toward me, but I stopped her with a smile. "I'll be right back," I said. And then the door opened. Mac stepped in first. He wore a perfectly tailored dark blue suit, his medals aligned in a neat row over his heart. The carbon fiber prosthetic was visible beneath his pants, not because he wanted pity, but because he didn't care to hide who he was. He carried himself like a man who'd earned every step. Carter followed, crisp black suit, polished shoes, and his city council pin catching the light. He had that confident, deliberate stride that made people turn to look without even knowing why. The room shifted. Conversation slowed. People glanced, then glanced again. I walked over and greeted them both like the brothers they were. "Glad you could make it," I said, my voice carrying just enough to be overheard. Mac grinned. Carter shook my hand firmly, and we moved toward the center of the room. Richard's eyes landed on Mac's medals, then dropped to the prosthetic. His expression faltered for half a second before the politician's mask snapped back into place. Susan's gaze went straight to Carter's council pin, and I saw her recalculating, trying to figure out how this fit into her perfect social equation. We didn't rush to sit. Instead, we mingled. Mac chatted with a couple near the bar, telling a light-hearted story about a military cook who could burn water. Carter struck up a conversation with one of Richard's business associates, and within minutes, they were laughing like old friends. Every move was intentional. We weren't bragging. We weren't lecturing. We were simply being ourselves. And it was working. People were drawn to us, curious, engaged. The in-laws couldn't steer the spotlight away, no matter how hard they tried. When we finally sat down, we made sure to take seats directly across from Richard and Susan. The tension was subtle, but it was there. Richard asked Carter a few polite questions about city projects, clearly testing him. Carter's answers were smooth, professional, and just political enough to show he knew exactly what he was doing. Mac, meanwhile, kept the mood light with humor, but every so often, his hand would brush the medals on his jacket, and Richard's eyes would flicker toward them like a moth to a flame. I stayed mostly quiet, letting the two of them set the tone. This wasn't my moment, not yet. This was about letting Richard and Susan feel the ground shift under their feet without quite knowing why. By the time the appetizers arrived, I could tell they were uneasy. They'd expected me to be the odd man out again. Instead, the room felt like it was orbiting around us. And that was exactly what I wanted. If there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that silence can be more dangerous than shouting. And that night, the silence between Richard and Susan said more than their words ever could. We weren't ignoring them. Far from it. But Mac and Carter had a way of steering every conversation without looking like they were steering it. Mac would drop a quick, funny story from his deployment. Nothing heavy, just enough to hint at the weight behind it. Carter would follow up with a local government anecdote that tied back to community service. And then I'd drop in a quiet comment that made it clear we weren't talking about theory. We were talking about things we'd lived. I caught Susan staring at Mac's prosthetic again. She wasn't disgusted. No. She was curious, maybe even unsettled. It was as if she couldn't decide whether it was a badge of honor or a reminder of something she didn't want to think about. Richard tried to reassert control with a story about some high-profile charity gala he'd attended. "We raised nearly $250,000 for the arts," he said, making sure his voice carried. Mac nodded politely, then casually mentioned how his unit had raised funds to rebuild a school in a war zone, and how they'd done it without donors sipping champagne under chandeliers. The table went quiet for a beat before conversation awkwardly shifted. The more they tried to pull the spotlight back, the more it slipped away. People wanted to hear about the school. They wanted to hear Carter talk about the city's new veterans housing program. They wanted to hear me talk about the guys who taught me more about loyalty than any CEO ever could. I could feel the heat rising from Richard's end of the table. His smile got tighter. Susan's laughter became just a little too loud, the kind you use when you're trying to pretend you're still enjoying yourself. Then came the moment I knew we'd fully taken the room. The restaurant owner, the Marine veteran Carter had told me about, stopped by our table. He shook each of our hands. thanked us for our service, and then told Mac and Carter that dinner was on the house. You could practically hear the air leave Richard's lungs. Susan glanced at her husband, and in that flicker of eye contact, I saw it, the first crack in the armor. They weren't the ones holding court anymore. They were just two overdressed guests at someone else's table. I leaned back, letting the conversation flow, sipping my drink while Mac and Carter worked the magic. This wasn't about humiliating them outright. Not yet. This was about making sure, when the final blow came, they'd already be off balance. By the time the main course was cleared, Richard and Susan were quieter than I'd ever seen them. My daughter noticed too. She kept looking between me and them, confused, like she couldn't quite figure out what had shifted. She'd find out soon enough. The plates from the main course had barely been cleared when I saw Carter glance at me. A quick nod. Our signal. It was time. The private room had that warm after-dinner buzz. People were sipping wine, leaning back in their chairs, talking in smaller groups. The perfect moment to capture the room without forcing it. I stood, slowly enough to draw eyes, but not so fast that it looked staged. I held my glass in one hand. "If I could have your attention for just a minute," I said, my voice calm but carrying. Conversations quieted, and all eyes turned toward me. Even Richard leaned back, clearly expecting some polite, forgettable toast. "First," I began, "I want to thank my daughter for inviting me here tonight. And I want to thank all of you for making me feel welcome." I paused just long enough to let the irony pass unnoticed by most. "But I'd especially like to thank these two men right here." I gestured to Mac and Carter. Mac gave a small nod. Carter sat like a man who knew exactly what was coming. "Some of you may not know them," I continued. "Mac and I served together overseas. He's the reason I'm standing here today, quite literally. Carter served too, and now he serves in a different way, as a leader in our city, fighting for those who've worn the uniform." I saw a flicker in Richard's expression. Not anger yet, just a tightening around the eyes. "These men," I said, "represent the very best of what this country produces. And I've been thinking for a long time about how to honor them, and the thousands like them who don't always get the recognition they deserve." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the first reporter slip in quietly through the side door, camera hanging at the ready. "So tonight," I said, lifting my glass higher, "I'm proud to announce that, in their honor, we are opening the MAC, Carter Veteran Support Center. It will provide resources, job training, and community for those returning from service." Murmurs ran through the room. My daughter's jaw dropped slightly. "And thanks to Councilman Carter's work," I went on, "the city has granted us the perfect location. Some of you might know it. It's right next to the Green Oaks Country Club." I let that hang in the air for a heartbeat. That way, every time people gather there, they'll be reminded of the service and sacrifice that keep this country free. I swear I heard Susan inhale sharply. Richard's jaw tightened, his glass frozen halfway to his mouth. "Here's to Mac, to Carter, and to every veteran who's ever given more than they got back," I said, and raised my glass. The applause was immediate, loud and genuine. People stood, clapping, some even cheering. The reporters were taking pictures now, flashes lighting the room. Mac and Carter rose to their feet beside me, shaking hands, smiling. Across the table, Richard and Susan clapped too, but their smiles were brittle, their eyes saying what their mouths wouldn't. This wasn't supposed to happen. And that was exactly the point. The applause rolled over the room like a wave, but I wasn't watching the people clapping. I was watching Richard and Susan. They were still smiling, but it was the kind of smile you wear when your teeth are clenched so tight your jaw might crack. Their eyes darted between each other, between me, Mac, and Carter, like they were silently asking, how the hell did this happen? I didn't need to say another word. The beauty of it was, I'd already said everything that needed saying, and I'd done it in a way they couldn't openly challenge without looking like villains in front of an entire room. The reporters moved in, snapping photos, asking Carter about the news center, getting quotes from Mac about what it meant to him. I stayed a step back, letting my friends take the spotlight. This wasn't about me being the loudest voice in the room. It was about making sure Richard and Susan knew they'd lost control of it entirely. I caught my daughter's eye. She was still seated, hands resting on the table, her expression caught somewhere between awe and confusion. She mouthed the words, "You did this." I gave her a small nod. Richard tried to start a new conversation with one of his friends, but it died almost immediately as the guy turned to ask Carter about veteran housing. Susan attempted to draw a group into talking about an upcoming charity event, but they excused themselves to go shake Mac's hand. It was surgical. Every attempt they made to regain the room just slid through their fingers. They weren't the center anymore. They weren't even part of the main orbit. And the silence between them was deafening. After about 10 minutes of press questions and congratulations from the guests, I checked my watch. Mac caught the signal, and so did Carter. We didn't need to drag this out. I walked over to Richard and Susan, still smiling that brittle smile. "Thank you for the evening," I said warmly, extending my hand to Richard. He shook it, stiff, cold. Susan offered her cheek for an air kiss, but her eyes didn't match her lips. Then I leaned in just slightly and said, low enough for only them to hear, "Now you'll never forget who I am." I stepped back, motioned to Mac and Carter, and we headed for the door. The room didn't even notice us leaving at first. They were still talking about the announcement. But when they did, more applause followed us out. The cool night air hit my face as we walked to the parking lot. None of us spoke for a few moments. Finally, Mac chuckled. "That," he said, "was worth every damn second." Carter nodded. "You didn't just win tonight. You rewrote the script." I looked back at the restaurant one last time, imagining Richard and Susan sitting there, trapped in that awkward silence, forced to smile through gritted teeth as people kept talking about a project they had no part in, but would have to see every week for the rest of their lives. Some people think revenge has to be loud to be satisfying. They're wrong. Sometimes, the loudest revenge is the kind you deliver without raising your voice at all. 2 months later, the Mac Carter Veteran Support Center opened its doors. The place was everything we'd envisioned. Clean lines, bright open spaces, a job training room, a counseling office, a community lounge. The walls were lined with photos of local veterans, some smiling in uniform, others in candid shots from everyday life. On the main wall, in bold letters, was the motto Mac came up with: "We stand for those who stood for us." Opening day drew a crowd bigger than I'd expected. Veterans, families, local business owners, even a couple of city officials who'd never shown much interest in our community before. The press was there again, cameras flashing, reporters asking Mac and Carter about the programs we'd be running. I stood near the entrance, shaking hands, greeting people, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just pride, but peace. This wasn't about Richard and Susan anymore. This was about turning their attempt to silence me into something that would outlive all of us. And yet, they showed up. Richard and Susan walked in, dressed like they were attending a museum gala. My daughter trailed behind them, looking nervous. Richard offered me a polite handshake. Susan gave me that perfected smile of hers. But neither of them could hide the way their eyes moved over the photos, the flags, the people in the room. They were guests in a world they'd tried to pretend didn't matter. My daughter hugged me. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she whispered. I nodded, because in that moment, I didn't need anything else. When it was time for speeches, Carter spoke first, then Mac. I went last, keeping it short. This center is for every veteran who's ever been told to tone it down or keep it to themselves. You've earned your story, and it deserves to be heard. The applause wasn't just noise. It was a wall of support, a sound that wrapped around you and stayed. After the ribbon was cut and the crowd began to thin, I stood outside, watching the sun dip low over the building. Mac clapped me on the shoulder. Carter just smiled. We didn't need to say anything. The fight was over, and we'd won. Now, for those of you watching this, what do you think? Did I do the right thing by turning their insult into something permanent and public? What would you have done in my place? If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment with your thoughts. I read every single one.